couple of years ago at RSA, we started the conversation of integrating security into the software development lifecycle, and rather than being at the end, right? Rather than it just being something you do later on. So I'm bringing this conversation to Phoenix. We just announced the presenters. We've got John Willis, who's been with where is he? He's been like with Chef, Docker, Conical, Ubuntu, Stateless Networks. We've got someone from Verizon, Nortel Networks, a really decorated CISO, Rob Richardson, whom I'm sure many of you have probably seen. He speaks on JavaScript and a bunch of stuff like that. So we've got quite a few speakers. It's a full day. We're also doing, I bet you noticed the price tag. The venue is a little expensive, so we've got a lot to cover. But there is a free happy hour that we're doing. Well, at least, welcome to attend and buy a beer. Where did I put it? It's here somewhere. So this is an option to go to the happy hour. All the speakers committed to going to the happy hour as well. So that's the 12th. Let's see. So it's at Walter Station Brewery, which is a brand new brewery on Washington. Parking can be a little hectic, but yeah, highly recommend. So yeah, Hacking Hired. What I realized coming from IT recruiting, there's not a lot of transparency to the process, and even in my own experience, looking for a job is really stressful. So I wanted to think of a way to take some of that stress out of it and break it down. And so I looked at what the vectors are. If you are ever in a hiring position and you have some pointers for me to include, please let me know. If you're an educator and you'd like to share these slides, you're welcome to do that as well. They mentioned Pittsburgh. I'm a little beat up. I just spent 5 days in Pittsburgh. This is the largest crowd I ever spoke in front of, and it was, I'm really glad I took the picture before, because I sort of got really rattled during, but everybody's super nice. It was a great talk. I do a bunch of different things, blah, blah, blah. I've been in recruiting for about 10 years and focused on security for 3. And this is kind of the idea behind it. If we all better understand the process for, I'm going to come over to the side so I'm not blocking anybody. If we all better understand the process, we can do better at winning the game. And that's the goal of this talk. So the 4 vectors, tools, tech, orgs, and people. And I'm going to kind of break down into each of them. I might go a little fast on resumes. I did publish these slides to my LinkedIn, so you're welcome to grab those. You also don't have to connect with me. I posted an update today, and it's linked in there, so you don't have to connect with me, but you're welcome to do that as well. So resumes, we throw this factor around a lot. I've looked and tried to get the source for it, but they say the average recruiter spends 6 seconds on your resume. I know that feels like it's not a lot, but if I'm looking at 300 resumes in a couple of hours or in a day, I'm looking for very specific information. It's kind of like a SQL developer gets really good at, or a developer at all, gets very good at looking at code and looking for those specific identifiers. I will spend more time on a resume that flags quickly as the right resume. So what I'm trying to do is give you the tricks to be the right resume. And the first thing to think about is your audience. So there's a big trend in visual resumes with graphs and pie charts and stars and blah, blah, blah. If you are hand delivering, including email, if you're directly providing that resume to someone, you can do that. But if a computer has to, or an application has to look at your resume, you're going to want to make it simple and plain and following a consistent format. And I'll go into more why. And overall, keep it simple, plain formatting. The year of, or the decade or century of 1-inch margins are out. Printers are very modern now and can get very close to the edge. I wouldn't say keep your text all the way to the edge because white space is your friend, but you can get a lot more on a page now. I'm also a big fan of sans serif fonts. That means no Times New Roman. If I'm looking and reading a lot of text in a day, those little serifs just make my eyes start to get fuzzy and bleed. So, think about like when you're reading fonts for development, you want plain Jane fonts. And be careful with color. I see a fair amount of red. Red is considered aggressive. The red team, right? And even if you're going for a red team role, consider your audience. There's a piece there. It just has a psychological reaction to it. And if you have 6 seconds and you're probably dealing with a recruiter, they're probably not going to have the same resonance as a sweet hacker, red teamer, pen tester person, right? So just another thing to keep in mind. And the objective is pretty old school. Everyone's listening to WIIFM, what's in it for me. So your future employer wants to know what you're going to contribute right away when you first get there. If you are just freshly graduating, that is different. They do want to know what your objective is in your career, but overall, summarize what you're bringing to the table. Format order, this is something we can go into a little bit more in depth. I'm happy to speak with anyone directly too. And then for dates, one of the things that I didn't know when I first started my career is that if I just put the date range of my college, it makes it look like I didn't graduate because there's no completion date. Something, they won't necessarily rule you out for that, but it does create a question. And the more questions about your resume, those usually aren't a good thing. They usually translate to red flags. And then only put your GPA if it's really good. I've seen people put like 3.2, you're in the threes, but you had a lot more work to do. If it's 3.2 and you were working 2 full-time jobs, that's outstanding, but I might not have the time to translate that story when I read your resume. And then, some of us who have been doing this and doing, as I like to say, the Lord's work for a decade or more, you might have a resume that's 4, 6, 10 pages. I've seen them. It's painful. I respect that you've spent a lot of time on it, but brevity is the soul of wit. And there are ways to condense that and translate it. And while it is relevant that you have been doing it for that long, there's also ways to communicate that. Let's see. So, and then this is something both for the young and old. It is important to have a brand. It's not necessarily like how I have all purple or that kind of thing, but what happens when I Google you? If you're trying to prove that you have the skills, there are ways to do that online. You can do things like bug bounty programs, HackerRank and HackerOne, even creating a presence for yourself on Twitter. There's definitely options out there. And I always like to be sure to make sure that everyone knows about the e-discovery industry and that the large major corporations are keeping track of your social media profiles, even if they're not public. And I like to say this because you have children or your children have children, and they may think that their stuff is private, but if they do ever intend to work at some of these large major corporations, it's most likely that even if their profiles are private, that data does get to somewhere. And we are reaching the age where there is a lot of private quantifying happening. Where your data and information is pre-qualified before even the recruiter sees it. So job boards, and this will kind of lead into that. The parsing technology in job boards. When I mentioned the audience to which you're sending your resume is important, this has to do because of parsing technology. And that's part of the reason why you want a simple, consistent resume that follows a format so that the parsing technology can recognize it and plug it in. That parsing technology sometimes gives your resume a score. And that's what I was alluding to, where they sometimes make these decisions without the recruiter. And that e-discovery could feed into that in the future as well. It's sort of reminiscent of China's social credit system, right? If we're not careful, we can end up in something like that too. So job boards. When it comes to putting your resume on job boards, you want to beef up your key skills. You want to find ways to get that information on your resume multiple times because it will increase how you show up in a search for a recruiter or in the database. There's that old trick of adding a dump of keywords at the end of your resume. I only recommend doing that on job boards. I wouldn't do that on like a direct application. Another way when you are directly applying to a job is to make sure that you're beefing up on the keywords that are in the job description. Because at this point, those, say, major enterprises that you're applying to, they have a system that quantifies your resume against the job description and gives that score to the recruiter. And then the recruiter then prioritizes out of the 300 resumes which ones get a 5 stars. So I'm going to look at those first. And they might not ever have the time to look at the other resumes. So make sure that your resume is addressing what the job description says. So organizations. Not everybody wants to work at a startup. Not everybody wants to work at a major corporation or for the government. And make sure that some of us learned that along the way. I think I learned that along the way. But take that time to think about those things. And then also, an interview is a two-way street. I like to remind my candidates that you might have dodged a bullet. Robert tells a really great joke, and it's probably the first joke that I was able to execute on, but recruiting day is a much different day than every day in that business. So the day that they're having candidates come in and showing off all the cool stuff, that's recruiting day, and it might not look like that when you show up on your first day. So make sure you're interviewing them and you're talking to other people. You have resources like Glassdoor. Take that with a grain of salt, but it's like Yelp reviews. But it's really your job to do your due diligence as well. And if you don't get the job, maybe it was meant to be. And just a little note, only Lord among us likes giving bad news, right? So it's often the recruiter's job to deliver the message, and they probably weren't the one that got to decide the message. So just keep that in mind. If you do have a recruiter that takes the time to call you and tell you didn't get the job, you're doing that because they really care. They could have sent you an email, and those emails are pretty rough anyway, right? So I get this question a lot, so I wanted to make sure I included it as well. There is some misinformation out there. Actually, one of the writers and women that I really appreciate what she has to say, her name is Liz Ryan. She writes a lot about finding jobs and selling yourself, but she really gets it wrong when it comes to compensation, because she's talking about like executive level searches, but when it comes to the rest of us, we do need to be able to talk about compensation. And what I suggest is thinking about what your minimum is, and then padding that a little because nobody wants to take their minimum, and then doing research about what other jobs are paying in your field or in your industry, and having that information and providing a range to the recruiter. Because really what the recruiter's job is to make sure we're in the same ballpark, because there are different ballparks, right? Someone who's worked for large financial corporations is probably going to be getting more money than someone that's been working at mom and pop shops. It's just the reality of it. But you can get from a mom and pop shop to a large financial organization if you create a range. And so then the recruiter knows that you have an idea of how much money you could be making if you worked for them. And you're still in the conversation, and you get to prove to the hiring manager that you're worth hiring. And then when you get an offer, you can say, wait, well, I'm fairly certain that given what you're asking of me in this position and the type of contributions I'm going to be making for an enterprise of your size and scale, I really thought that I was expecting this to be this size compensation. Could we have a conversation about that? And it presents a way to begin those negotiations. But if you don't provide a range, you're not going to get a chance to get to the negotiations, because the recruiter's job, one of them, is to make sure that you're in the ballpark. So pay rates. This is definitely more geared to my fellow ladies. There's a lot of statistics that show that that really comes from our first job. We don't negotiate our compensation on our first job, which sets a pace for the rest of our earning years. But I think that there's also some good information there for everyone. This book is actually, it's called Women Don't Ask. It has some great negotiation processes in it as well. So I do recommend it for everyone because navigating that pay compensation negotiations can be tricky. And then litigation mitigation. I feel like that's kind of like my School of Rock phrase. Why pay grades? Why degrees? Why do they need a degree for this? It's it's only 2 years of experience. Why do they need a degree? Well, the simple thing is that companies create pay grades and then define what's required to fall in a certain pay grade. you can kind of see it's like, bands and different grades. And basically, with some corporations, once you make X amount of money, you have to have done X, Y, and Z. And especially with cybersecurity positions, they are often better compensated than other positions in the organization. And so you get to this point where your income qualifies for a higher pay grade, even though it's really a junior or entry-level position. So how do you, if you're going to get paid this much by us, you have to have a degree. And that's a policy across the organization to minimize the likelihood of them getting sued, because it's a consistent policy, right? And that's really where it comes up. The other time it comes up is when you're looking for maybe you've been in your job for 10 years, you never got your degree, you've got your certs, you've been doing it, you're the architect, you got to figure out, then you want to go for that management job, or you want to be in that architect job, but you can't because you don't have a degree, and it's really because of the pay grades. I know a network architect who does some really, I'm not going to swear because we're on camera, does some really cool stuff, does stuff with NASA, works for a large defense company, and he literally had to go back and get his degree to get to the next stage in his 6-figure salary. And so it was like just that box that he had to check. But it was because we talk about audits and policies and controls, it goes back to that. So recruiters, our favorite subject. Yay. So the thing is, the reality is they all have the same goal. Everybody wants to hire. Unfortunately, there's a lot of broken processes in place, and there is a lot of vitriol thrown at recruiters in HR. But the reality is they also have to be the scapegoat. Legally, they are the front line and defense for the organization, and companies do some shady stuff when they hire, or hiring managers have some shady opinions when they hire, right? So the recruiter has to be the buffer for that. It kind of goes back to the bearer of bad news, and they have to play defense. So they are the scapegoat, and they are the one that everyone gets to blame. They're also not all created equal. There's a kind of a joke that nobody decides to go into HR, which is not true. I have met them. There are degrees, but people sort of end up in recruiting. For me, it was a passion for advertising, but also it was a system. It was actually when jobbing.com first started about a decade ago, and I was applying for jobs, and they posted new jobs. I was spending so much time applying for jobs. I watched them post new ones, and I was like, there's people behind this, and oh my God, that's cool, right? And if I was going to sell something, I'd rather sell a job than people than cars, really. So in-house, talent acquisition. This is your corporate recruiters. I love these memes because it's like all of the different perceptions, right? And there are definitely times when I feel like this is all corporate recruiters are doing. Why haven't I gotten my feedback? Where are they? So what my friends think I do, this is what the party in the office. What my mom thinks I do, hang up a help wanted sign. Society thinks I spend a lot of time on vacation. Corporate recruiters do get those sweet paid time off. And then what applicants think I do, laugh at resumes. What I think I do, I'm a superhero, and what I actually do is find the needle in the haystack. And having been a corporate IT recruiter, it's ridiculous how many resumes you get for, say, like a project manager or even a software developer, and those resumes just don't, like, it's the wrong tech stack, and it's just like there's complete mismatch, right? It's like a lot of people just hit apply to everything. And then the idea of having to look through 400 resumes, it's a lot. So there is that aspect. The other aspect to this is what the job description says and what the hiring manager wants, and trying to make those two things come together. That is the needle in the haystack. The other thing too is, as a corporate recruiter, they're often working a lot of jobs. Before I started my company, I received an offer for a corporate IT recruiter opening for a local organization that has a global reach, and they wanted me to be working 50 open requisitions at any given time. And that's a lot. That's a lot of jobs to be working, and a lot of hard jobs to be working, and that was just going to be the consistent pace, right? And it wasn't a unique or special case. It really was across the board. And then, regularly seeing hundreds of applicants per, and then having to deal with hiring managers as well as their corporate policies, because hiring managers like to go rogue. There's a lot of issues that corporate recruiters deal with. So kind of understanding where they're coming from in order to better hack them and activate them. One of the things I hear corporate recruiters complain about a lot is when a job seeker finds them on LinkedIn and says, I want to work for your company. Hey, can you help me get a job? And the recruiter's like, we have a job board and it has a list of openings. Have you, did you find a specific job that you're interested in? Are you messaging me about something specific that I could maybe address? But, there's just broad openings or broad messages can be really a big hurdle. The other one that's kind of a struggle is if you apply for every single job, because then not only do I need to look at and deal with and disposition your resume 7 or 10 or 20 times. I also have to decide which one you might be most interested in. And making decisions for myself is hard. I don't want to have to make that decision for you. So some things to keep in mind with corporate recruiters. So agency recruiters, these are, like me, third-party recruiters. So what my friends think I do, drink beer. What my mom thinks I do, meetings all day. What society thinks I do, hustle used cars. Customers think I do, roll in the money. And what I think I do, herd cats. It's definitely pretty accurate. And what I really do is put my face in my hands. And both of these are very accurate, actually. This is feel a little personally attacked by this meme, but no, I'm kidding. I think there's a lot of perception to it. There's definitely third-party recruiters that are possibly stationed in India and using VoIP systems and may call you 75 times a day. Those people exist. There's also local people that either are still learning recruiting or just don't have the same heart in it that others do. But I will say that most of the agency recruiters that I've met really genuinely care about people and are working very hard to solve a problem of really having 2 customers and helping those 2 customers come together. And we often, even with our great clients, don't get feedback very quickly. We just sat down with a client last week who brought in all the agencies and said, tell us what you think. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What we were doing right was about 15 minutes, and what we were doing wrong was about 45 minutes. And the big thing was feedback, and getting them to commit to giving feedback within 48 hours. They wouldn't commit. It was pretty rough. And we were, there was 8 different agencies at the table, and we were all saying the same thing, and we just couldn't get that commitment because the talent acquisition team couldn't get that commitment from the hiring managers, so they couldn't make it to us. And we're racing against the clock. Usually agency recruiters are contingency, which means they only get paid if you get hired. And that means that they're going to talk to several of you that will never get paid for. So we're putting in a lot of time on something that we, it's sort of I guess I like gambling a little. Because essentially what I'm doing is you're my horse, right? I'm taking a bet on you as my horse. And we're also juggling many clients, but we also consider, the good ones among us, we consider you our candidate or client as well. And it's a 2-way street. So, going with the interviews, like I mentioned earlier, I just wanted to make sure I iterated again. You've got to have great questions. The more you can get them talking, the better they're going to think the interview went. You want to make sure you succinctly deliver what is your strong points, but the more someone talks, the more of a positive experience they have. And overview of what the 4 main vectors are. Does anybody have any big questions on any of this? Hey, Troy.
So tell me about the role that networking plays in finding a job or in finding a placement.
That's a great point. I would say that kind of goes back to the people side, and also a little bit of tech. I did mention on the list LinkedIn and how LinkedIn's its whole other presentation, but I think networking and attending events like this is extremely key. When it comes to standing out above the crowd, networking and connecting and having relationships is really a core component to this. I couldn't underestimate what it means between learning something, but then also networking. And it reminds me of something, we do a monthly career panel with 3 folks who talk about how they got into cybersecurity. And we always ask them like what to avoid, what pitfalls. And one of them was, don't burn a bridge. And that goes back to the networking piece, because even if you work at a horrible company, quote unquote, and you work with a bunch of people and some of them seem horrible and some of them seem great, you think you are aligned with the right ones, you never know, 5, 10 years later, you're probably going to end up working with those people again, especially in security, right? It's a real small town in a big city. So, being cognizant of how you act and how you treat people is all part of building that network.
Okay. My next question is concerning job fairs.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about their role and their impact.
So I think job fairs are very important. It's a great opportunity. While I shared the complaint of corporate recruiters, getting that like, hey, I want to work at your company. When it comes to a LinkedIn message, that they get buried in those kinds of things. But a job fair is a great time to make that kind of, hey, I want to work at your company, right? The hard part is that the recruiters are just inundated. So when you do a job fair, you want to make sure you're getting that recruiter's contact information and finding out who specifically you're going to follow up with. And maybe not the next day, but maybe the 2 days later when kind of they've had a chance to recover. Even the extroverts need a little time to get over all of that hubbub of the space, but it is very important for making those connections. Learning those social cues of when to engage and when to thank them for their time, those types of things. What's your next question? Those 2?
No, that was it.
Okay, and he had his up and then I'll do yours.
How do you deal with the unicorn situation when you see job requirements? They want to CISSP and 4 years as a Duke and DOS ESCJCF.
You to be the department too, right?
Yeah.
You get to run the department, but you don't get to hire anybody.
Yeah, I don't work those recs. That's how I deal with them.
That's risk avoidance.
Right, exactly. No, I've definitely had to work those recs before. I would say as a job seeker, usually when you're looking at those laundry lists, right, usually there's at least a couple of bullets that are like 8 years of X and 2 years of Y, right? And it's usually like 8 years of IT experience and 2 years of security experience, or 10 years of IT and 5 years of security, right? So when I talked about that summary on your resume, make sure that your summary addresses the big swatches of those requirements, because really most of those recruiters, that's what they're trying to quantify, is whether you meet those 8 years of experience of this, 10 years of experience of this. And so if in your summary you can address that right away, that'll help them have confidence to dig into some of the details on your resume. They say that, I forget what the figures are, but that men will apply if they feel like they meet 2 of the requirements, and women will apply if they feel like they meet all the requirements, that kind of thing. I think as long as the scope falls within your scope, I would encourage you to apply. I wouldn't necessarily encourage someone who's junior to apply to that type of role, but you might as well get yourself in the database. But I don't think you're going to get looked at. I just wouldn't apply to every security job. It's really an issue. I don't have a good solution for it. Yeah, it's proof they don't know what they're looking for, right? So perfect example. One of my friends and clients, CTO, she's been in IT forever. She's been overseeing essentially secure development for 2 years, and she sent me an application security architect job description, and I immediately called her and I said, please don't post this. don't even put this on your resume, because even if I fix this for you, find you a candidate, and they see that what you posted on your website, they're gonna wonder what I'm getting them into. Like, she had like, she had certifications that had nothing to do with application security development. They had two of the bulleted lines were exactly the same. They were just in different places. Like, it was just like they threw a bunch of stuff together, and like, can we go back through these job descriptions? But everyone's moving so fast, and they're just like, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. Let's put that in there, right? It is a problem. So usually, if they're being audited by their job descriptions, they need a resume that matches like the big pieces, right? And usually that's number of years and the type of scope. And sometimes it's also certifications. But usually the certifications are or. But it's a case-by-case basis, and we could dig into it more if you want. You had a question? Yeah?
So I've been on LinkedIn for a long time,
Zero. They're also not validating profiles. They're not validating jobs. They're not doing any of that. I didn't put it on here. I stopped talking about it, but take your physical address off of your resume. Use a Google Voice or some other buffer phone number. Dice does pretty well at vetting Indian recruiters, but it's really easy to obfuscate. There is a fair amount of just data collection happening, so keep that in mind. It's a complicated, I affectionately call it the recruiting tar pit. Good people go in and they just get stuck. You always, OPSEC, keep your information secure. You never know when it might be a good opportunity, but how much data are you giving out?
But I'm wondering, how soon is it to ask things like about salary and vacation? Because I feel like I pass up so many potential opportunities because I don't want to go through that whole process and then find out, they're only willing to offer me 3 weeks of vacation.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and it was something that I had to hurdle with too as an agency recruiter. I don't want to give out the company I don't want to give out my client name until I know you're like actually interested, but I know you probably don't want to spend time on the phone unless you know it's gonna, boop boop, right? Like, you want to meet in the middle. I think it's totally fair to ask target compensation, like they might not want to give away the full budget, but like, okay, what's your client trying to, what are they trying to pay for this? Do they have a good vacation policy? You might have, keep a text file with your standard response and include for yourself and say, look, I'm not moving unless it's this much money and this much vacation pay and this much this. And so you can just send it to the recruiter. Like, I'm happy, I've been here a while. I'm interested in moving, but it's got to be this, this, and this. And then that tells them, they don't want to waste their time either. They're working their butts off, right? So have your kind of standard reply.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
AZ Job Connection validates the employer and the job seekers.
AZ Job Connection?
Yeah, it's from
Okay.
At AZ at Work.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Definitely. Because they're asking for assistance from the local government, that they then get validated for sure.
Do you see, is that a conversation you have with them?
I tend to, because partly I have guarantees on my placements. Usually it's only like 90 days, but I want them to stick, right? And because I'm in such a focused niche, that's part of the reason too. So where are you going to go today, but where do you want to be in 5 years, right? And what does that look like? I don't hear that a lot from other recruiters, partly because we're also stretched on time. But that was part of why I wanted to focus on a niche, was to be able to have those broader conversations. And I think it's important. I try to make sure I talk about it with students. One of the things a couple of CISOs have said to me is, it's pretty easy for students to get into some of these larger enterprises. The problem is those large operational SOCs, they usually get stuck in one type of job. And so then you might end up being the firewall person, and you're going to end up being the firewall person for the next 5 years of your life unless you work very hard to get out of that. Some of those SOCs are good at cross-training and helping people get other skill development, but traditionally those larger enterprise SOCs kind of pigeonhole you, and then you're on that track for that one thing. They do it in IT as well. So you become the Active Directory guy, right? Which is cool because Active Directory is a really good skill, but there's a lot more to networks and infrastructure than that. So that that's a lot of times with the younger people or fresh grads, that's something I talk about. So I guess I have time for more questions. Sorry.
Any others?
No? Yeah.
Where on LinkedIn are your slides for downloading? I'm looking.
Oh, okay. So I did just post an update, so it'd be under activities. And then also if you go to my current employment, which is Recruitment Security, it's posted as one of the media items. That in the 10 minutes I spent on posting it today, that's where I figured out how to put it. But yeah, it should be there. You're also welcome to email me or message me, Bill, and I can send you a copy of them. Okay. You're welcome. Yeah.
You were talking about a fellowship, or not fellowship, but increasing our presence as far as posting on Stack Overflow and stuff like that. I didn't think that was really that. I tried to make my online presence very minimal, so that's why. How critical is that?
I wouldn't say it's imperative. I wouldn't say it's completely critical. There's two sides to it. One is if you don't make it, somebody else might. There is a fair amount of fake LinkedIn accounts, or to basically have a placeholder that is you, right? So that's one thing. The other ones is if you're a developer, having a GitHub is important. It's like having a portfolio, like an artist. Some of these are different, but being able to, if you are new to the career and you're trying to get into penetration testing, that type of thing, it's a way to create a reputation and show what you've done, right? But I wouldn't say it's mandatory, especially if you've been in the career for a while. There's other ways to show that and demonstrate it. One note is that if you compete in CTFs, this is more like putting it on your resume. And even if you didn't win or you didn't place top 3, the fact that you went through the activity and that you did the thing, that's important as well. It's a lot of times we think, oh, well, I didn't win, so I shouldn't put it on there. That's different than the GPA. This doing the CTF is as much the process of having done it, right? Does that kind of address your question? I think, one of the reasons with GitHub is great for developers is that it has this cool, cool visual that shows, like, every day that you do a commit, you get colors, and the more commits you do on a day, the darker the color. And that's a visual thing recruiters really dig, right? And even hiring managers, right? And there is a version of that for CTFs as well too. I can't recall what it's the name of it right now. Maybe somebody knows it, but it does the same thing where if you compete and take and participate in the bug bounty program, it creates this graph of your participation, and so it kind of shows you build a profile like that. HackerRank? Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you.
So some of us, like Lexicon, we're trying to stay off our presence, so we stick out like a sore thumb because they can't find anything about us.
Yeah.
So when we do CTFs and we use our handle names and whatnot, so it doesn't match our resume, so they go, what name is this, other than you
right. So no, I see that a lot, and so basically you're choosing to put that on your resume. You might, and maybe you don't want to, but if you're doing good stuff and not bad stuff, like if you're doing legal things, right? Like you could put that on your resume. You might not necessarily have that attribution to you out in the wild, right? And you might not put that resume on a job board, but if you specifically apply to something, or you've then had a conversation with a recruiter, you know what? Let me give you my full resume. That you've seen my public resume. Let me give you my full resume. And I see that often with some red teamers, and they might have like their Twitter handle matches their HackerRank handle matches their, right? So they have their persona, like grifter, for example, right? And he's done his talks with that name. He's got a whole persona with it, and he has a real name as well, right? In theory, he's a real person, right? No, kidding.
Do you recommend not documenting your Silk Road development?
I recommend documenting it, yes. I mean, if you're doing something illegal, that's between you and the man. Probably wouldn't help you get a job anyway, but
What are your thoughts on personal profile websites, like GitHub pages or something like that?
I think that they can be valuable. Especially if you are looking to get that type of job, it helps show that you've been doing the thing, because that's the hard hurdle for anyone who's new to get into the career or pivoting into the career. What your biggest hurdle is to convince your employer that you're already doing the thing they're going to pay you for. It's kind of obnoxious, but they usually want to hire somebody who's already been doing this exact same thing somewhere else with the exact same job title. They almost never hire up, right? You come in and you have to prove, and then you get promoted up. You have to have already been doing that thing. So creating an online profile is a way of showing you've been doing that thing, and essentially building a portfolio of what you've done and what you've accomplished.
How often do you have to deal with non-competes from overcoming?
I would say when I was doing IT sales recruiting, which, okay, holy cow, that was almost harder than IT recruiting because their egos, believe it or not, their egos are bigger than y'all's. And the competition's higher. There's a lot of sales organizations for technical sales here in the Valley. There's, yes, sometimes non-competes. I actually worked for an employer that sued some of my friends and coworkers because they started a new company and then, called all of their old clients. My former employer ended up paying for all of their lawyers. It was essentially, they ruled against them in the state of Arizona. I am not a lawyer and I cannot provide legal counsel. And if you want, I can tell you the case and you can go look it up. Essentially, the ruling is you cannot prevent someone from earning a living, right? The difference is if you are taking proprietary information or information you wouldn't have had unless you worked for that company, right? So if you are doing something that you figured out yourself, or you met that person and you created that sale, or you built that tool, you might be able to take it. But usually your employment agreement, keep this in mind as security professionals, if you're building a tool, it is quite often the property of your employers, even if you did it at home, but you were under the employment of that employer. I do have a client in the Pacific Northwest, is a small security firm, where he does not do that. His employment agreement does not include ownership of intellectual property, and he does encourage his team to build tools and to share exploits and that kind of thing. But if any of those larger companies or more traditional companies are going to own your IP, they'll own it's usually really broad, and you can negotiate this out sometimes, but they'll own everything that you do, even if you did it when you were at home. Because how do you prove whether you did it at work or not? So keep that in mind. I'm seeing some scrunchy faces, but companies are usually really aggressive in their employment agreements. Whether or not they're executed or enforced, that's another thing. But yeah, if a company can get something from you, they're probably going to try. I think I saw another hand. Okay.
Which is good, because we have 7 minutes left, and I know sometimes you have things coming up here, so we can break this up.
I just really like.
She's going to be right out here to the left with some chairs and things.
What?
Answering questions, signing autographs.
Taking neck massages.
Taking massage, yeah, exactly. Thanks,
Thank
Rachel.
you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you
so much. Good hand. Thank you guys. Again, if you like this, come again.